He was ranked number one in the world indisputably for 5 years from 1965 to 1969 and by some sources also in 1964 and 1970. Laver won 198 singles title, which is the most won by a player in history. And Roger Federer regards him as the greatest tennis player to have ever played the game. Laver won 11 Grand Slam singles titles and 8 Pro Majors titles. He completed the Grand Slam, that is winning all 4 slams in a single calendar year in singles twice, in 1962 and in 1969. The achievement in 1969 remains the only time a male tennis player has done so in the Open era. Rod Laver also completed the Pro Slam, that is winning all 3 Pro Majors in 1 year in 1967. Rod Laver won titles on all court surfaces of his time: grass, clay, hard courts, carpet, and also on wood. And he contributed to 5 Davis Cup titles for Australia during an age when the Davis Cup was deemed as significant as the 4 majors. The Rod Laver Arena in Melbourne and the Laver Cup tournament are named after him. Let's discuss the details of Rod Laver's biography in this video. Rodney George Laver was born in Rockhampton in Australia on 9th August 1938. He was the third of 4 children of Roy Laver, a cattleman and butcher, and his wife Melba Roffey. Amongst his relatives were the cricketers Frank Laver and Jack Laver. Laver was a teenager when he left school to pursue a tennis career that lasted 24 years. He was coached in Queensland by Charlie Hollis and later by the Australian Davis Cup team captain Harry Hopman. Harry Hopman gave Laver the famous nickname Rocket. Laver was both Australian and US junior champion in 1957. He had his breakthrough on the world stage in 1959 when he reached all 3 finals at Wimbledon, winning the mixed doubles title with Darlene Hard. As an unseeded player, he lost the singles final to Peruvian Alex Olmedo after surviving an 87-game semi-final against American Barry Mackay. His first major singles title was the Australian Championships in 1960, where he defeated fellow Australian Neil Fraser in a 5-set final after coming back from 2 sets down and saving a Fraser championship point in the 4th set. Laver captured his first Wimbledon singles crown in 1961, beating Chuck McKinley in straight sets in the final, which lasted just 53 minutes. Laver was ranked the world number 1 amateur in 1961 by Lance Tingay. In 1962, Laver became the first male player since Don Budge in 1938 to win all 4 Grand Slam singles titles in the same year. He won an additional 18 titles for a season total of 22. Among those titles were the Italian Championships and the German Championships, giving Laver the clay court triple of Paris, Rome and Hamburg that had been achieved previously only by Lew Hode in 1956. At the Australian Championships, Laver beat Roy Emerson in the final. The biggest hurdle to Laver's winning the Grand Slam was the French Championships on slow clay courts, where Laver won 3 consecutive 5-setters beginning in the quarterfinals. In his quarterfinal with Martin Mulligan, Laver saved a match point in the 4th set with a backhand volley after coming to the net behind a second serve. In the final, Laver lost the first 2 sets and was down love 3 in the 4th set before coming back to defeat Emerson. At Wimbledon, his progress was much easier. Laver lost only 1 set in the entire tournament to Manuel Santana in a quarterfinal, who held a set point for a 2-set lead. In the final, Laver beat Mulligan in 52 minutes. At the US Championships, Laver lost only 2 sets during the tournament and defeated Emerson again in the final. Laver was ranked world number 1 amateur for 1962. In December 1962, Laver turned professional after winning the Davis Cup with the Australian team. After an initial period of adjustment, he quickly established himself among the leading professional players such as Ken Rosewall, Lew Hode and Andres Gimeno, and also Pancho Gonzalez, when Gonzalez returned to a full-time schedule in 1964. During the next 7 years, Laver won the US Pro Tennis Championships 5 times, including 4 in a row beginning in 1966. In the beginning of 1963, Laver was beaten consistently by both Rosewall and Hode on an Australian tour. Hode won the first 8 matches against Laver and Rosewall won 11 out of 13. However, Laver won the best of 5 set matches against Rosewall at Kooyong Stadium and at Adelaide's Memorial Stadium. By the end of the year, with 6 tournament titles, Laver had become the number 2 professional player behind Ken Rosewall. In the first phase of the World Series Tour, Laver finished second with a 25-16 record. The top 2 players, Rosewall and Laver, then played a series of matches against each other to determine the champion. Rosewall won 14-4. In 1964, Laver and Rosewall both won 7 important titles, but Laver won 17 of 24 matches against Rosewall and captured the 2 most prestigious titles, the US Pro Championships over Gonzalez and the Wembley Championships over Rosewall. In Tennis Week, Raymond Lee described the Wembley match where Laver came from 5-3 down in the 5th set to win 8-6 as possibly their best match ever and one that changed tennis history. Lee regards this win as the one that began and established Laver's long reign as world number 1. The other prestigious title, the French Pro, was won by Ken Rosewall. Rosewall finished top of the official points table in 1964, and after winning at Wembley, Laver said, "I've still plenty of ambitions left and would like to be the world's number 1. Despite this win, I am not there yet, but Ken is." In 1965, Laver was clearly the number 1 professional player, winning 17 titles and 13 of 18 matches against Ken Rosewall. In 10 finals, Laver won 8 against the still dangerous Pancho Gonzalez. Laver won the Wembley Pro, beating Jimeno in the final. In 1966, Laver won 16 events, including the US Pro Championships, beating Rosewall in the 5-set final, the Wembley Pro Championship, again beating Rosewall in the final, and 8 other important tournaments. In 1967, Laver won 19 titles, including the Wimbledon Pro, the US Pro, the Wembley Pro Championships, and the French Pro Championship, which gave him a clean sweep of the 4 most important professional titles, a professional Grand Slam. The Wimbledon Pro Tournament in 1967 was the only professional event ever staged on Wimbledon Centre Court before the Open era began. With the dawn of the Open era in 1968, professional players were once again allowed to compete in Grand Slam events. Laver became Wimbledon's first Open era champion in 1968, beating the best amateur American Arthur Ashe in a semi-final and fellow Australian Tony Roche in the final, both in straight sets. Laver was also the runner-up to Ken Rosewall in the first French Open. In his first Open year, there were only 8 Open events besides Wimbledon and the French Open, where professionals, registered players and amateurs could compete against each other. The professionals mainly played their own circuit with 2 groups, National Tennis League and World Championships Tennis, operating. Laver was ranked number 1 universally, winning the US Professional Championships on grass and the French Pro Championship on clay, both victories coming against John Newcomb. Laver also won the last big Open event of the year, the Pacific Southwest in Los Angeles on hard courts. Ashe regarded Laver's 4-6, 6-love, 6-love win in the finals over Ken Rosewall as one of his finest performances. Laver's post-match comment was, "This is the kind of match you always dream about, the kind you play at night in your sleep." In 1969, Laver won all 4 Grand Slam tournaments in the same calendar year for the second time, sealing the achievement with a 4-set win over Tony Roche in the US Open final. He won 18 of the 32 singles tournaments he entered, still the Open era titles record, and compiled a 106-16 win-loss record. In beating Newcomb in 4 sets in the Wimbledon final, he captured the title at the All England Club for the 4th consecutive time that he had entered the tournament. He set a record of 31 consecutive match victories at Wimbledon between 1961 and 1970, which lasted until 1980 when it was eclipsed by Bjorn Borg. If you want to check out my video on Bjorn Borg, you can click the link in the description. Unlike his first Grand Slam year in 1962, Laver in 1969 played in events open to all the best professional and amateur players of the world. In the year's Grand Slam tournaments, Laver had 5 5-set matches, twice coming back from 2 sets down in early rounds. In the 4 finals, however, he lost a total of only 2 sets. His hardest match was a marathon 90-game semi-final against Roche at the Australian Open under tropical hot conditions. Other opponents at the Australian Open included Roy Emerson, Fred Stoll and Andres Jimeno. At the French Open, Laver beat Jimeno, Tom Ocker and Rosewall. At Wimbledon, Laver overcame strong challenges from Stan Smith, Cliff Drysdale, Ashe and Newcomb. At the US Open on slippery grass courts, he defeated Dennis Ralston, Emerson, Ashe and Roche. Laver proved his versatility by winning the Grand Slam tournaments on grass and clay, plus the two most important hardcore titles, the South African Open at Ellis Park, Johannesburg, and the US Professional Championships at Boston, and the leading indoor tournaments Philadelphia US Pro Indoor and Wembley British Indoor. In the early 1970s, Laver lost his grip on the major tournaments. He played only 5 Grand Slam tournaments from 1970 through 1972. This was partly because of his contracts with NTL and WCT, but on the WCT tours he remained the leading player and by far the leading prize money winner. In 1970, Laver won 15 titles and more than 200,000 US dollars in prize money. Overall, despite turning 30 just months after the Open era began, Laver had tremendous success, winning 74 singles titles, which remains 7th most of the era. Plus, like most players of his day, he regularly played doubles, winning 37 titles. Now let's talk about a few of Rod Laver's storied rivalries. Laver had a long-running friendly rivalry with Ken Rosewall between 1963, when he started out as a pro, and 1976 when both were semi-retired from the main tour. Including tournaments and one-night stands, they played over 130 matches, all of them as professionals, with some results from the barnstorming pro tours lost or badly recorded. Overall, a match score of 89 to 75 in favor of Rod Laver can be documented. Against the older Pancho Gonzalez, whom he played from 1964 to 1970 on the pro tour, Laver had a lead of 43 to 22. Laver had another, even longer rivalry with his fellow Queenslander Roy Emerson. They met first on the Senior Amateur Tour in 1958 and dominated the amateur circuit until 1962, before Laver turned pro. When Open tennis arrived in 1968, Emerson joined the Pro Tour and had many new battles with Laver. Overall, the score is 49 to 18 in favor of Rod Laver, with 7-2 in major Grand Slam tournaments. Laver had also many battles with Lew Hode in his first years on the pro circuit from 1963 to 1966. Although he lost the first 8 matches in January 1963, Laver later in the year began to turn around the rivalry, and until 1966 he had built a 38 to 21 lead. Against Arthur Ashe, Laver had a head-to-head lead of 21-3, winning all of the first 18 matches. Ashe's first win came in 1974 when Laver was 35. Another young rival in the Open era was John Newcombe, whom Laver led 16-5 in their head-to-head score. Laver also helped Australia win the Davis Cup 4 consecutive times from 1959 to 1962. In 1973, professionals were permitted to play in the Davis Cup for the first time, and Laver was on a winning team for the 5th time, claiming 2 singles and a doubles rubber in the final as Australia beat the United States 5-0. Australia were crowned Davis Cup champions in each of the 5 seasons Laver played in the competition. Laver won 16 out of 20 Davis Cup singles matches and all 4 of his doubles. Rod Laver was of average height and medium build. He was 1.73 meters tall, that is 5 feet 8 inches. Laver developed a technically complete serve and volley game with aggressive ground strokes to back it up. Commentator Dan Maskell described him as technically faultless. His left-handed serve was well disguised and wide swinging. His ground strokes on both flanks were hit with topspin, as was the attacking topspin lob, which Laver developed into a weapon. His stroke technique was based on quick shoulder turns, true swings, and accurate timing. His backhand, often hit on the run, was a point ender that gave him an advantage. Laver was very quick and had a strong left forearm. Rex Bellamy wrote, "The strength of that wrist and forearm gave him blazing power without loss of control, even when he was on the run and at full stretch. The combination of speed and strength, especially wrist strength, enabled him to hit ferocious winners when way out of court. At the net, he had forcing volleys, often hit as stroke volleys. Especially on the backhand, he could hit sharp underspin angles as well. He was difficult to lob because of his springing agility, and when forced to retreat, he could come up with a vicious counterpunch." As an amateur, Laver was a somewhat flashy player, often a late starter. He had to learn to control his adventurous shot making and integrate percentage tennis into his game when he turned professional. In his prime, he could adapt his style to all surfaces and to all conditions. Laver had a strong record in 5-set matches, often turning things around with subtle changes of tactics. Laver is regarded by many as the greatest tennis player in the history of the sport. Laver was ranked the world number 1 amateur in 1961. Laver was also the number 1 professional in some rankings in 1964, in all rankings from 1965 to 1969, and in some rankings in 1970. Jack Kramer, the long-time tennis promoter, ranked Laver only in the second echelon of great players, just behind the 6 best. He writes that although Laver was absolutely unbeatable for a year or two late in the 1960s, a careful comparison could be made between Laver and the somewhat older Gonzalez, and that Kramer is positive that Gonzalez could have beaten Laver regularly. Kramer's main argument for downgrading Laver is that Ken Rosewall beat Laver in those two World Championship of Tennis finals, and that was a title Laver really wanted. Kramer sees as evidence of Gonzalez's superiority over Laver the fact that Gonzalez defeated Laver in a five-set match before 15,000 spectators in New York City's Madison Square Garden in January 1970, when Gonzalez was 41 years old and Laver was still considered the world number one player. On the other hand, Gonzalez was still a top 10 player when this match took place, and Laver subsequently won this event, beating Gonzalez in a straight set semifinal. Overall, his head-to-head record with Gonzalez was either 35-19 or 38-21 in favor of Laver, depending on the source. Laver was 12-5 against Gonzalez during the Open era, although Gonzalez was then in his late 30s. In 1975, Don Budge ranked his top 5 players of all time and rated Laver number 5, behind Wines, Kramer, Perry and Tilden. In 1978, Ellsworth Wines ranked his all-time top 10 in tennis myth and method and rated Laver number 4, behind Budge, Kramer and Gonzalez. In the early years of the 21st century, Sidney Wood compiled his list of the greatest players of all time, later published posthumously in a memoir, The Wimbledon Final That Never Was and Other Tennis Tales from a Bygone Era. Wood first entered Wimbledon in 1927 and won the title in 1931. From that time on through to the late 1970s, I was privileged to compete against virtually every top player in the world, said Wood. Wood ranked Laver number 5 behind Budge, Kramer, Tilden and Gonzalez. In 2014, Frank Sedgman, in his autobiography, Game, Sedge and Match, ranked Laver number 3 behind Jack Kramer and Roger Federer in his list of greatest male tennis players of all time. Many experts disagree with Kramer's assessment of Laver. For example, Dan Maskell, John Barrett, Butch Buchholz, Cliff Drysdale, Joe McCauley, Ted Schroeder and Tony Trabert rank Laver as the best of all time. Schroeder has been quoted by Alan Trengove as saying, "You take all the criteria, longevity, playing on grass, playing on clay, amateur, professional, his behavior, his appearance, in all criteria, Rod Laver is the best player of all time." Trabert said in January 2008, "I still maintain that Rod Laver is the best player who ever played the game because he's done something no one has ever done in the 120 or 140-year history of tennis. He won the Grand Slam as an amateur and he won the Grand Slam as a pro. If someone in some other sport held a world record no one else had, you would say that person was the best in that sport. So in my view, you've got to say Rod Laver is the best player of all time." Similarly, the tennis author Peter Bodo wrote in May 2008, "Give him credit? Shoot, the only real issue is whether the GOAT, greatest of all time argument, is a debate at all, given that posting those two slams puts Laver in a league of his own." Other experts cite the fact that during his amateur, touring professional and open era careers, Laver won a record 184 singles titles. He also holds the record for most titles won in a single year during the amateur era. He also holds the record for most titles won in a single year during the amateur era, the most titles won in a single year during the touring pro era. He also holds the record for most titles won in a single year during the amateur era, during the touring pro era, and during the open era. After turning professional, he also holds the record for most titles won in a single year during the amateur era, 22 in 1962, during the touring pro era, 19 in 1967, and during the open era, 18 in 1969. After turning professional in 1963, Laver won the US Pro Tennis Championships 5 times and the Wembley Pro Championship 4 times from 1964 to 1967. In 1967, Laver won a professional Grand Slam by winning all 4 of the major professional tournaments, the US Pro Championships, Wembley Pro Championships, French Pro Championship and the Wimbledon Pro. In 1983, Fred Perry ranked the greatest male players of all time and put them into 2 categories, before World War II and after. Perry ranked Laver number 1 in the post-World War II list. Laver came out on top in various expert polls for the best of all time. In 1986, the US magazine Inside Tennis polled 37 experts, which resulted in a computerized tournament Laver ranked first on this list ahead of John McEnroe, Don Budge, Kramer, Bjorn Borg, Gonzalez, Tilden, Jimmy Connors, Fred Perry, and Lew Hode. In a poll by the Associated Press in 2000, Laver was voted the male tennis player of the century ahead of Pete Sampras, Tilden, Borg, Budge, McEnroe, and Hode, Rosewall and Roy Emerson, and finally Kramer. In an article in Tennis Week in 2007, the tennis historian Raymond Lee statistically analyzed the all-time best players. Laver topped his list ahead of Tilden and Borg, Roger Federer, Gonzalez, Rosewall, Budge, Lendl, Connors, Sampras, McEnroe, and Kramer. In 2009, it was written that Rod Laver is considered by most folks who saw him play and many who've heard of his accomplishments to be as great a tennis player that ever lived, current players included. In July 2017, tennis player Roger Federer called Rod Laver the greatest of all time.